Gosh, it's so hard to I'm on like 2 different monitors here, trying to make sure I can control things, but also my computer is starting to take off. My fans are running at full blast.
Ooh. Yeah, the dual monitor setup is really great, but I feel like, especially when I'm sharing things, I always have a moment of panic where I'm like, please work the way that I need you to, because you just never know if things just go awry.
I know, and every once in a while, my mouse will go off screen and it'll do the thing where it splits everything, and then I'm like,
yeah,
everyone sees everything on my desktop. I'm like, oh god, if I don't have some Slack up or something,
Right.
I guess we'll just give it another minute. It looks like we're doing well. Hey crew, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Pretty good. Pretty good. I was telling Alice, crew, that I'm just going to leave a moment for us to introduce ourselves as well, after I say hello. Okay, we can get started, I guess. All right, so hi everyone. Welcome. The Allegheny Science Policy and Governance Group is really excited to bring you a really interesting career panel today on science policy and communication. And we are excited to have 3 panelists with us today from various different the government or academic institutions, and we're going to chat a little bit about some questions. We'll start with some introductions. My name is Kira. I am a 3rd-year graduate student in PMI, or the Program for Microbiology and Immunology. I'm in the lab of Dr. Terence Dermody, where I study a virus and how it transports along neurons in the brain. And I also have 2 co-hosts with me today that can go ahead and introduce themselves, Alice and crew.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alice. I'm a 4th-year PhD candidate in health policy and management in the School of Public Health. I work with Dr. Marian Jerlinski, and a lot of my research with her focuses on looking at substance use disorders among the pregnant population, specifically pregnant individuals with opioid use disorder and access to opioid use treatment. And my dissertation focuses on looking at the impacts of medical cannabis legalization on people with chronic non-cancer pain and mental health conditions such as anxiety and PTSD.
Hi everyone, my name is Kritika. I'm a 2nd-year MPH student studying epidemiology. Currently, I'm involved in 2 research projects. One is with the School of Public Health, where I'm looking at spontaneous abortion and paternal characteristics, and the other one is basic science research looking at atherosclerosis.
Great. So we're here to kind of help things facilitate today. So I'm just going to briefly go over what the structure of the event will be, and then we'll get into some introductions of our panelists. So the way that we're going to set this up is we're going to ask each of our panelists to give a 5-minute or so, just broad introduction to their career path, some of their professional interests, and where they are now, how they got there. And that will kind of set the stage. Then we will talk a bit about some questions that we've prepared for all panelists, or maybe some more specific questions. And following that, we'll leave some time for audience questions. So if you have anything, or if you think of anything, go ahead and throw it in the chat whenever, and we'll get to it at the end. And I think that covers everything. And if anyone has any questions or anything for me or about the event afterwards, hopefully you guys all have my contact information from some of the registration and stuff. So feel free to shoot me an email, or any of us that are hosting. We would love to kind of get you back in the loop if you wanted to learn a little bit more. So with that, we'll begin our introductions, and Alice can go ahead and start us off.
Great. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Ellen Neff. She's currently a science communications manager at Columbia University covering quantum physics. She received her Bachelor of Science degree at Pitt before completing a master's degree in marine biology at Northeastern. Ellen has worked for several different sectors, including the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, KBR Weil, during which she worked on a project with NASA. and most recently as a senior editor and writer for Lab Animal, a scientific journal under Springer Nature. So very excited to have her here on the panel today, and can't wait to get into some of those conversations.
Do you want me to introduce
I'm sorry.
myself now?
Yes, Ellen, if you don't mind, introducing yourself.
Yeah, sure. My 5 minutes. It's funny, for the past few years, I've been on the other side, being the one asking the questions, and now it's kind of funny to be on the one being interviewed and explaining. But yeah, I'm Ellen. I'm undergraduate class of 2010 from the University of Pittsburgh in bio. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania and north of the city in Butler, if anybody is familiar. But like many children of the 90s who grew up watching Free Willy and Flipper and The Little Mermaid, I always wanted to be a marine biologist. So after I graduated from Pitt, I was thinking about, where I was going to go. I was thinking vet school, but that marine bio kind of never really left me. So I found a program through Northeastern that was really kind of an immersion opportunity to really kind of get hands-on, actually get by the ocean. I studied in Boston, Panama, and out in Washington for my degree, and then ended up in Maryland at the Smithsonian to do my master's thesis, which was a great experience. I loved it, but I realized that, academia wasn't the way I wanted to go. I wasn't interested in kind of going on to a PhD. So at that point, it was off to the job market for me. My boyfriend's now husband of many years, so probably it's 10 years for us this fall. He moved down to the DC area while I was finishing up my degree, and so we ended up staying in DC we were there for 5 years total. So I kind of bounced around a little bit. I went and did an internship at a nonprofit at Oceana, which is an advocacy-based group in DC. I then went to the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, where I was doing kind of environmental review and GIS work for permitting and things like that. And then the bulk of our time in DC, I was with a project with NASA doing earth science metadata, which is something nobody cares about, but is very, very important. Everybody that's doing data should care about your metadata and making sure it's available. And that was kind of the first experience to kind of editing and writing and things like that, because it was my job to sort of quality control these data records that were coming into the project that I worked for. So I was there for 3 years with the NASA project, and then my husband and I were kind of reaching our late 20s. He works in finance and always wanted to get up to New York. And so we just it was a bit of a jump moment. We kind of like, if we don't go now, we're not going to end up going. And so I said, I'm not going without a job, and just started looking. And I ended up finding, very kind of serendipitously, the position I had with Lab Animal, which is a small kind of niche title in the Nature portfolio focused on preclinical biomedical research using animal models of human health and disease. So while I was there for 5 years. I only just joined Columbia, but with Lab Animal, I was their magazine editor. So it was my job to do reported stories, to do research highlights, to commission scientists and animal care staff and veterinarians to write opinion pieces and things like that, and really kind of help build out the scope of this journal. The chief editor who hired me was kind of looking to expand its reach and kind of make it a little bit more prominent. And so I was there to kind of cue to the community what we were interested in, and kind of reach out and talk to people in the labs and see what they were doing, and have the chance to write about it. So yeah, I spent 5 years there, and kind of that position, ran its course, and I was just kind of ready for a new challenge. And I saw it was last summer I was looking, I saw the position with Columbia doing quantum physics communications. And I kind of said to myself, if I can figure out how to communicate quantum physics, I can communicate anything. And I just, I applied. It was a new challenge. I got the job and started kind of late September. So I'm still kind of in the kind of early phases of it. I've been there for about 6 months, but it's the first time this position has existed for the quantum initiative. There's some kind of figuring things out and kind of making it the job that I want it to be. But my task now is to communicate the research that the quantum faculty at Columbia are doing to the wider world, both their peers at institutions, to industry that's interested in the technologies that they're developing, and also to a general audience, to help explain what quantum is and why it's important and why everybody should care. And I don't know if that was 5 minutes or not, but that's kind of where I am. Perfect. Thank you. Crew, if you want to go ahead and introduce Jonelle.
Yeah, thank you so much. Our next panelist is Dr. Jonelle Drugan, who is currently a science policy analyst at the NIH. Dr. Drugan received her BA from Wittenberg University in biology, her PhD from UNC in biochemistry, and her MPH from Pitt in behavioral and community health sciences. Some of Dr. Drugan's current roles include overseeing a $170 million NIH Common Fund program and coordinating the biomedical partnership between the NIH and NASA on the International Space Station.
Thank you for that introduction. I clearly need to update my bio since I haven't done NASA in quite some time, but that was one of my favorite projects that I got to work on. So my career path has been twists and turns of, it's going to sound like finding a whole bunch of things that I didn't like. But the reality is there's so many things that I am interested in. I'm more of a generalist. So when I got to grad school and was focusing on the little tiny part of a protein that interacted with the little tiny part of another protein, and I didn't love it enough to make my career out of it. I had started out with an interest in science, majored in biology, and thought I was going to go to medical school until after doing 2 years of volunteering in the emergency department of a local hospital, I switched over to one of the patient care wards and realized I don't really like sick people, which is kind of a crucial thing if you're going to be a doctor. So there I was, a senior in undergrad, going, oh no, now what do? I'd already taken the MCATs, I'd already applied to graduate school or to medical school and gotten accepted. And it's like, I don't know that this is what I want to do. So I applied to art school and got accepted there, but ended up not going to that either, because I figured if I couldn't, decide between medical school and art school, maybe I should just get a job and take some time and make some money instead of, throwing more money into education if I didn't really have a true focus. So I got a job working in a lab and really enjoyed the excitement of the discovery, and got into grad school and did quite well in graduate school at UNC Chapel Hill and enjoyed it. But when I looked around at the faculty that were truly happy, I didn't have that love of the science that they had. I could look around and see a lot of miserable tenure track people. But the people that were really happy, they had this drive and they couldn't imagine doing anything else. And I'm going, there's a lot of things I could imagine doing. So I applied for, well, first I thought maybe I just wasn't cut out for academics. Maybe I should go look at a postdoc in a large company, interviewed for one of those, didn't really feel the love there. Maybe I should try a small startup company. That didn't really resonate. And I found this program at the University of Pittsburgh, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, but it was sponsored by the Department of Energy. And to be honest, I applied for it because it was paying like, $5,000 more a year than a traditional NIH postdoc. And they would pay for me to get a master's of public health. And I thought that sounded like a pretty good deal since I didn't really want to do biochemistry and biophysics anymore. And did that program. It shames me as a feminist to say this, but I followed a guy to the DC area. We were doing the long distance relationship thing while he was finishing his postdoc and I was doing my postdoc, and we realized that if this was going to work, we needed to be in the same place, and we've been together 26 years, so I would say it worked. But he got a job at the National Cancer Institute, and so I followed him, got a position at the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements doing science writing. And that seemed like a really good fit. Problem was, this was a small nonprofit that was having small nonprofit financial difficulties, and they ended up laying off all of their scientific staff. And so government working for the National Institutes of Health certainly had its appeal after watching what could happen in the nonprofit, no matter how noble and committed you are to the mission. It was like, you know, being a professor all over again, living grant to grant. And that wasn't what I wanted to do. And I ended up at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute in their policy office. Really enjoyed it. A position opened up in their legislative affairs position. The woman who had that job retired. That was a promotion. I took it. I was miserable. I hated it. It was, people either love it or they hate it. And the self-imposed crises of Capitol Hill just made me crazy. It was like, you know, I work in the planning office. I'm a planner. And, you know, what do you mean you have a, you know, we're having a hearing in 2 days? Surely you knew about this before. And I ended up back in 2006 moving to my current position, which is at the National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases. And I'm in their policy office. I don't do anything with legislative affairs. I do a lot of report writing. I write talks and presentations for our institute director to deliver. I work with our program staff planning meetings where we bring in scientific experts to tell us about some of the cutting edge science opportunities that are out there. And I do work somewhat with Congress. I do a lot of summarizing science for congressional reports. And that's really a fun challenge of how do I, in 3 sentences, explain, set up the background, tell them what the investigator found and why it's exciting. And that's kind of a nice little challenge that I try to, you know, set myself up with every time I try and sit down and write something with a congressional audience in mind. Is, you know, you assume that your reader understands what DNA is, but maybe doesn't understand what a cytokine is. And so that's sort of where I draw the line is, you know, I can use the word DNA, but cytokines become signaling molecules. And that's not 100% correct, but it's close enough. And it's not really, it's writing things on a level where people can get excited about what we're doing and, you know, respecting your reader and respecting their intelligence. So I've been in my current job since 2006, and every time I think, oh, maybe the grass might be greener someplace else, something new will change in my work environment, and it's like, oh, maybe I'll stick around and see how this pans out. So thank you very much, and I look forward to taking questions after Andrew introduces himself.
Great, thank you. Right, so our last third panelist is Dr. Andrew Hastings, and he is a public health analyst in the Legislative Affairs and Correspondence Management branch of the Office of Communications and Government Relations at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. That was a mouthful. So Dr. Hastings received his PhD from Vanderbilt University, where he studied human metapneumovirus and then went on to do a postdoc studying Zika and dengue virus vectors. And following his postdoctoral position, Dr. Hastings was a AAAS Science and Technology Fellow in the same department that you are in right now. And you can go ahead and introduce your background.
Yeah, so I guess my background starts at the very beginning of my life. I was born with a genetic disorder that's very rare. And when I was born, they didn't really know what underlies the disorder itself, didn't know the genetics or really what was going on. But due to congressional interest in rare diseases and the money that's flowed to research in rare diseases over the course of my lifetime, it's gone from not really knowing what's going on to identifying the specific SNPs that underlie the condition that I have, and even coming in close to perhaps finding a cure for people, for children before they're born. So I've seen firsthand two things. One is the power of small changes in DNA and the power of science throughout my entire life as it affects me. I've also seen the power of attention on a specific issue within the government that can really change people's lives. So that kind of underlies a lot of what my career path was as I've gone through. I also was very interested in viruses. I credit that a lot to the book, The Hot Zone. Perhaps you all know of it. Richard Preston wrote it. I actually got to meet him at a conference, which was like really highlight of my career. It's a little bit, unrealistic, but it was fun, and it got me interested in viruses. So when I started graduate school at Vanderbilt, I was interested in viruses. I actually did at Vanderbilt, you do rotations through different groups, and one of the groups was Dr. Dermody's lab. I worked in his lab for a few weeks, ultimately ended up in Dr. Williams, John Williams, who's now at Pitt. He was at Vanderbilt at the time. He was my mentor working on metapneumovirus. After that, I wasn't sure exactly where my career path, where I wanted to go, but I knew that if I wanted to stay in academia, I probably would want to do a postdoc. So I pursued a postdoc as I still tried to figure out what I wanted to do ultimately, and worked in the lab of Errol Fickrig at Yale University, working on how the spit of a mosquito can enhance viral pathogenesis and transmission. And it was very interesting work, but similar to others, I didn't really feel like academia was the home that I really wanted it to be. And I wasn't really interested in chasing after the next grant dollar as a PI. So I started exploring other options. And at Vanderbilt, I had an opportunity to come to DC and look at different, it was like a field trip to DC where you look at different fellowships and you go visit Congress, and the AAAS fellowship was one of the fellowships that was discussed during that trip, and I was very interested in it as soon as I heard about it, but particularly as I was trying to decide what I wanted to do, I started to pursue that. It's a long process for the application. I'm happy to touch base with anybody on this panel or on this call, Zoom call, about it if you're interested more in depth. But basically, it starts in November. We don't start your position till the next August. And during that course of time, you have a kind of a standard application process. Then you have an interview process where you have to write a one-page issue brief, which is just like a summary of a particular topic with recommendations. And then it's an in-person visit for a week to kind of go on speed dating with different government agencies, where I interviewed at the NIH at a few different locations, at the EPA, at the Department of Defense, at the Pentagon, Fish and Wildlife Service, USAID. I think that might have been it. Other people in the AAAS fellowship work across the government, State Department, NSF. And basically, the goal of the fellowship is to embed people who are trained as scientists, who have their PhDs, into the government in order to increase the scientific knowledge, basically, of the federal government. Every year there's, I don't know, around 140 maybe total fellows. Some of them are in Congress, and most of the congressional fellows are sponsored by different professional societies, but there's a couple that are actually sponsored by AAAS. Those specific spots are super hard to get. But the executive branch fellows, there's more of us. I think there's like, in my year, about 80 of us. So I did end up working or choosing, and the interview process is kind of interesting because it's not like, it's less that they're interviewing you, but you're kind of interviewing them. And at the same time, they're kind of feeling you out for how you're going to mesh. And in the end, they have a matching process. It's like a proprietary black box that they try to match people up with offices that they feel are appropriate for them and who have chosen them, and you've chosen to go to the. So I did end up at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is within my training and background in the infectious disease space. But many people end up in the AAAS fellowship far afield from where their training is, and they find it very fulfilling as well. So for the first 2 years, I was a AAAS fellow in the office I am right now. I transferred over to a permanent position a year and a half ago, basically doing the same thing, but getting paid a little bit more, which is nice. And within the Office of Legislative Affairs, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but I started in 2018 before COVID came around. So when COVID happened, my job description, while doing the same things, it radically changed both the volume of work that we experienced within our office, as well as, I used to, and one of the reasons I really loved it at first, I still love it, but one of the reasons I loved it at first was I get to look at all these different things: malaria one day, TB the next, dengue, flu. But when COVID came, it's basically all COVID all the time. Some people still are interested in other things, but basically COVID all the time. So it's been a little bit different, but at the same time, it's really increased the amount and the kind of like intensity of the work, and which has been an interesting experience. I have gotten to work very closely with Dr. Fauci, who, in my mind, before I started working at NIAID, was a celebrity within the virus world, and in infectious disease space more generally. But with COVID, he's reached new heights of celebrity, which has been interesting. Being on a Zoom call or being in person talking to him, and then the next 30 minutes later, he's on MSNBC or CNN talking to whoever. It's been a very interesting experience. So, but basically, to wrap it up, what we do in our Office of Legislative Affairs is we respond to inquiries from Congress. So those inquiries can come in different forms. They can come in the form of hearings, which we will prepare Dr. Fauci to go, or other NIAID senior staff to go onto the Hill, or it's been on Zoom recently, but it's getting back to normal. And prepare him with the most recent scientific information to go onto the Hill and speak intelligently about those things, which he's very adept at, as you all probably know. It can also, these inquiries can also come a little less formally through letters that we get, and also just through emails or phone calls that we get from different congressional staff. And we reach out to the scientific staff across NIAID to gather the information. And as scientists, you all probably know that, whatever you're working on is like the coolest and the best thing, and you want to tell everyone everything about it. So we take that huge volume of information and try to squeeze it down into a box that somebody who's interested in one little thing would be able to digest and understand. So it's been a really interesting experience over the last 3.5 years of doing that. And it's kind of my career path and also what I'm doing now.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. So we're going to, actually what I'm first going to do is turn off this screen share that is not acting like I wanted it to. So I'm gonna I have a couple questions that are essentially for the whole panel, so feel free to chime in. And then if any of the audience has questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat and we'll try and get to those after. So I'll introduce these questions, Alice will field any follow-ups, and then crew will field the chat questions. So I guess one of the questions that I wanted to start off with was, and this was kind of touched on by a couple of you, about some of the challenges that you've faced and some of the career pivots that you've done. And I know like a lot of you come from this biology or, you know, a more like technical research background, and some of the challenges maybe that you had to overcome in order to be professional at communication, which I think maybe now makes up the bulk of what you do. So sort of how did that pivot, and, you know, were there any unforeseen challenges that kind of came up during that change or that shift?
I'll take that one. I mean, some of them were very obvious that I knew I was going to have to give up. I was going to have to start working a standard business day. You know, I usually work 8 to 5:30. And instead of rolling into the lab around 11 o'clock, the advantage is I get done at 5:30. I'm not rolling out of the lab at 11 o'clock at night. So that was one of the things. It's a lot more sedentary being in communications. I drive a desk. I'm not walking around the lab on my feet for 12 hours a day or whatever. So I had to really adjust my diet and exercise routine, because I went from being constantly in motion to sitting at a desk for 40 hours a week. The other more subtle thing was the communication aspect. And whereas in the lab, where everybody is kind of a, dare I say, dog eat dog world, and there's lots of competition and everybody is trying to one up, it's a lot more political outside of the lab, or it's a different type of politics. And learning that double-blind communication of, if a guy says he's assertive, and if a woman says it, well, she's not a very nice word. And learning how to soften my tone and ask rather than tell, and not have to fight for every little last scrap that was the common culture in the lab that I had come from, which was it was just the way it was. And so I think I have become a much nicer person now that I am, in my current position. I think some of that might have been maturity, but also just the environment where it's not such a resource poor environment that you have to fight for every last little drop. And it's much more collegial and sharing. And I actually, Alice and Kira had sent questions in advance, and I crowdsourced them to my coworkers. And so if we get to one of those questions, you're going to be getting the bulk of not just my opinion, but there was one, it's like, okay, here you go, friends. What do you think? And how would you advise these grad students? And that nice collegiality that I didn't have growing up in grad school.
I'll jump in and say one thing that I found to be a challenge, particularly in my last job when I was wearing the hat of science journalist, was stepping away from being the expert to not being the expert and becoming comfortable with asking, feeling like you're asking, the stupid question, the basic question. Because when you're interacting with scientists, when you're acting with the experts, you need to cut through their jargon so that you can translate it to the wider audience that you're trying to reach to. And that's particularly when I was kind of first getting started, was a weird place to be. Like, I felt like I was asking the obvious question, and you just kind of have to become comfortable with that, because you need to get all those details, you need to get the jargon and the full context that then you can then simplify and translate and stuff. So that was an interesting experience to kind of to flip those roles a little bit as I got into science writing more and more.
I can chime in quickly. And one of the biggest challenges that I've faced, I think, and it's related, I think, to something that Jonelle said, is that, and it's specific to government, I think, although it could be in a corporate world as well, or in other realms. But when I was in academia, when I wrote something, I would sign my name to it, and it would be, this is what Andrew Hastings thinks, and sure, the PI would also like read it and say like, yeah, that's great, or whatever. But you had your own voice, and in this new position, I've had to adjust a little bit to speaking in other people's voices, whether that's Dr. Fauci's voice or other NIAID senior leadership. It's been a challenge a little bit. The other thing directly related to that is the amount of review that you have to go through within the federal government is insane. It's like, I write something, well, somebody gives it to me, I change it, they send it to my supervisor, sends it to their supervisor, then that goes back to the people who originally wrote it, goes back to me, it goes back to my supervisor, it goes above them, and then eventually goes to NIH Central. They look at it, they send it back. We have to do this whole process until it gets to HHS, and then maybe do another round of it. But the amount of, there's a reason why a congressperson writes a letter and it takes 6 months to get back to them. It's not because it takes 6 months to write it, it's because it takes 6 months for everyone who needs to look at it and put a stamp on it. So that's been a kind of a challenge and a frustration as I've gone into this. But it's also quite interesting to hear the different perspectives as it goes through those reviews.
Great. So I think we touched on this a little bit, I guess, but I'm curious to know, so in your day-to-day, like what sort of skills you use, and also if you could kind of touch upon some of the skills that you brought with you from your background that you think was applicable to graduate students. Like, what are things that we're currently working on that you think you maybe use on a daily basis, and then what are some skills that you thought you maybe had to learn a little bit more on the job, or maybe are still working on. I think that's always helpful as graduate students.
I think going back to some of what everyone has said so far in the realm of being able to give your elevator pitch kind of what your project is. It's been very helpful in the science when you go into more of a science communication thing. What's the most important thing? What do these people really care about that I can really highlight and make sure, I think actually Dr. Dermody may have said it when I was in graduate school, to tell the person what you're going to tell them, tell it to them, and then tell them what you just told them, kind of thing, where like you want to keep a focus and make sure you're speaking to your audience. And I think that's applicable both in graduate school as they're trying to be effective at writing papers, doing presentations, but also it's very applicable once you go into more of a science communication sort of role.
I agree with that. As you're doing your literature reviews to support like the papers that you're writing, you need to be pulling out kind of what's the key thing you want to get out of this paper. So you need to be able to kind of quickly move through dense documents and pull out the big picture, and that's going to feed into what you would end up writing. So I think I fell into science writing because I always enjoyed doing literature reviews. I always enjoyed reading and then writing up things up more so than I liked kind of doing the experiment itself. So doing that kind of practice and always just kind of having writing samples and things like that is definitely very important. So pursue that for sure.
It's definitely been a learn on the job. I did my PhD in a biochemistry cancer biology lab. And then I moved, when I started at NIH, I was in the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, which has nothing to do with cancer. And now I'm in the National Institute of Arthritis, Musculoskeletal, and Skin Diseases, which again has nothing to do with cancer and nothing to do with heart, lung, and blood. So it really is, as Ellen alluded to earlier, not being afraid to ask the very basic questions, not being the expert. Whereas, you know, at the time I was defending my dissertation, I was the expert on this little, you know, 81 amino acid fragment. And, you know, I was the person who knew that fragment. As Ellen said, you know, knowing how to read a cell paper without getting bogged down into all of the details. You know, start with the title, look at the abstract, look at that last paragraph of the introduction, look at the first paragraph of the discussion, look at the figure legends. You know, you don't have to read the entire paper. And, you know, I use very few of my science lab skills, but having that scientific degree and the graduate school experience has given me the confidence that I know if I don't understand something, it's not because I'm stupid. It's just because I haven't asked the right question and somebody hasn't explained it to me correctly. And I'm not afraid of big words. You know, it's like, okay, I know how to Google. There are a lot of times I'll come up with a word and it's like, okay, Google what the definition is. And then confirm with the scientific expert to make sure that I didn't water it down, you know, inappropriately. And, you know, the other thing, when you get through grad school, you have demonstrated to the world that you do not give up easily. Because if you were the sort who gave up, you know, you would never have survived grad school. So those are the skills I've taken with me into my jobs. And it's not the ones of how to run a page SDS gel or how to tune an NMR magnet.
That's awesome. Thank you. So I guess I'll next shift a little bit about maybe some advice that you have for graduate students. We're always trying to soak up as much information as we possibly can. And we've touched on this maybe a little bit. So, you know, some of these probably are going to be a little repetitive, but I think that kind of comes with the territory. But maybe you have some advice for things that you felt, and you know, not just writing and communication, but sort of relationships that you had and sort of environments that you put yourself in, and how maybe stepping outside of the lab was important. And so what kind of advice do you have for graduate students that may be looking to find their way into something like what your career looks like right now?
That's the question I cheated on and crowdsourced to my office. Perfect. And I got back, you know, some answers. One woman plugged the AAAS fellowship because she is a former AAAS fellow. And of course, that is a very, you know, competitive. It's great if you can get it. Know yourself and know what sorts of things you like to do and what sort of things you don't like to do. Are you more attracted to the written word or to reports full of numbers? Are you more attracted to formal, qualitative, and quantitative portfolio analysis? Or is it more of the broad brush anecdotal analysis that resonates more with you? I was going to say don't be wedded to one particular topic, but I realized that, you know, just how I'm wired, there was no way I was going to be wedded to one particular topic. Going back to the, do I go to med school or do I go to art school? Or maybe I should get a job. Be persistent. You're not going to get every opportunity you apply for. And keep an open mind. Don't be afraid to get out there and try something and go, no, this isn't for me. Going back to my experience with the, you know, legislative clearance process that Drew was telling me about. It's like, you know, oh my gosh, I had no patience and tolerance for that. But there are other things I can do in a scientific planning, policy, and analysis branch that, you know, doesn't involve the, you know, 6 months of, can we just get this over with and put it to bed? And there's enough, everybody brings their own strengths. And I'm really fortunate to be on a team where we all have our own strengths and we all have different interests, and it really complements each other really well.
I'll echo that point about kind of being open to things, particularly, you know, while you're young and coming out of school, as much as your circumstances allow, and say yes to things. You know, I don't believe there's a, you know, necessarily like a perfect job. Maybe it's there, but you really have to be at the right place at the right time to kind of land that. So all the things that you do, you're going to take things that are good from those. You're going to take things that are bad from those. Kind of embrace the experience. If it's not the right one, it's okay to move on, like Jonelle just said. So I think being open and trying things and finding your fit is good. And then for specific advice, if anybody is thinking about, you know, science journalism and that kind of getting into that kind of realm, make sure you're writing. I know in my last job, I commissioned freelance writers a lot. And the first thing I would do when I wanted to work with a new writer was I would Google them. I would look at their portfolio. Do you have clips? Are there examples that you can kind of communicate things clearly? And it doesn't have to be for, you know, the New York Times, the Washington Post. It can be for a blog, it can be your own personal thing, it can be for the college, for the university website or newsletters or things like that. But having examples and kind of building up clips, if you think you want to kind of go into that science journalism route, is definitely important. I know other editors felt the same way about that. We want to know that you can write and how you can do it, how you can like translate these complex things. So having a portfolio that you can kind of build with over time is I hope practical advice if that's something you might be interested in.
Yeah, I would recommend, you know, I like that advice of saying yes to things, to don't be afraid to say yes to things, because I think, you know, oftentimes people are afraid like, oh, I don't have the expertise to do that, or, oh, I can't do this or that. But really, like, you're in graduate school, so you're like an expert at learning, right? You're an expert at being able to learn on the fly and make adjustments and do things. So just try. The worst thing that's going to happen is you're not going to succeed in it, and that's okay. It's really okay. The other thing I would just recommend is, you know, along those same lines, is to try a lot of different things. So like, you know, and when you try those things, be that student government or different interest groups or this policy group, you know, it's important, particularly when you're going, I'm talking about for the AAAS fellowship particularly, there's a lot of really qualified people. They're going to be looking at what have you done when you volunteer to do things. Don't just be the person who volunteers and is just there and takes direction. Be the type of person who's like, okay, I'm here. Let me try to start something. Let me have something that's my own. So then when you go to your next job interview, be that the AAAS fellowship or be that any job interview, you can say like, oh yeah, I was involved in this group and I did this discrete thing, which means that I had to reach out to this group and that group and get a consensus. Because particularly, as you go forward in a lot of these positions, it's going to be a lot about finding a consensus and finding something that people can agree on as I don't want to say party line. That's not really a great word, but the message. What's the central message, or what's the accomplishment that we're coming? So those kind of things is like have an accomplishment when you volunteer to do things. Is, I think, really important.
Great. Thanks, guys. So we'll move into some audience questions if we have any from anybody who's attending. I also wanted to say if any of our panelists are comfortable, if you want to leave your contact information in the chat, your email maybe, feel free not to. That way, anyone who's here and has to step out, and we're kind of reaching the top of the hour, if anyone wants to contact you guys, or if that's okay. But yeah, we'll take any questions from audience. If anyone has anything, feel free to unmute or shoot it in the chat. Give it a second.
Hey, I have a question.
Great.
Yeah, so a lot of you have like PhDs and stuff that you've been in science policy and writing is a completely different subject. In like applying for those jobs and working in that stuff, was it ever viewed as a negative against you to have a different degree, or was it viewed as a positive as you're learning?
I'm maybe not the best person to answer this because I do have a degree that matches where I am right now. But I know that as I was, I know people in the AAAS fellowship who are in, I alluded to, completely different roles. Their experiences are really valued, and the way they think a little bit different is very valued. So don't, discount your experiences. Can be very applicable to other people. Just quickly, the job I looked at joining in the EPA, I was like, the EPA, I have no relevance to this, but actually they were looking at how do you do regulations on genetically modified mosquitoes. And so my, past experience would really play into what they're doing. So don't discount any experiences that you have. They could be really important for things you would never think of.
Thank you.
I know I came to science writing and science journalism from science. I work with science writers and science journalists who were writers first, who came to science and came the other way. And to that point, each direction kind of brings different strengths. So whereas maybe I pick up some of the science a little bit more quickly than some of my colleagues who didn't come from a science background, I sometimes take for granted that I know what terms are, and they kind of have a better perspective of doing that kind of translation and going to the higher level, because like the background is different. So there's pros and cons to both, but I definitely wouldn't say it's a detriment either way. It's just kind of figuring out what your strengths are and playing to those.
For my Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute job, they were looking for somebody who had writing skills and editing skills and attention to detail and the ability to juggle multiple projects simultaneously. So they weren't so much looking for a subject matter expert as they were looking for somebody who could pull all the pieces together. Now, when I moved to the National Institute of Arthritis, Musculoskeletal, and Skin Diseases, that was something that the woman who hired me had a concern about. And she straight out asked my references of, was I able to pick up on the science quickly? And fortunately, I had demonstrated that I could in my former job. So it really depends on the job and what the niche is that your employer is looking to fill. And for some people it matters, and some people it doesn't.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful.
So it looks like we have a few more questions in the chat. For Ellen, could you go over the pros and cons for working for a science publication versus a general publication?
Sure. So yeah, so my last job I was with a research journal. I was doing magazine content for it. And I will mention something that I think not everybody realizes that I didn't until I took the job. But if you're interested in communications and staying close to science, there are professional manuscript editors within the Nature portfolio, the Science portfolio. So it is the kind of alternative career path. If you want to be doing kind of peer review and staying very close to cutting edge, keep that in mind. But yeah, is in my role as kind of the magazine editor for the Science Journal, we're able to assume a little bit more of our audience because we know that they are interested in the subject. We kind of know what their background are. I was at a commercial entity that had lots of analytics and they knew who the audience was. We knew who our readers were. And so we could kind of make a little bit more assumptions and kind of use a little bit more technical language with them. Now that I'm at Columbia, going to across the board from both kind of faculty, peers, funders, general audience, you have to keep the most basic description kind of in the back of your mind and making sure that you are defining terms when you need to use them. So it's kind of an interesting balance to kind of communicate things to my faculty's peers because they want to recruit new faculty. They want to recruit PhD students and postdocs and show off what they're doing. So kind of walking the line of covering the details, but also defining and translating for someone who's interested but not an expert. It's a different kind of challenge to always have the non-expert kind of in the back of the mind. If that answers your question, if not, please feel free to follow up.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then for Dr. Drugan and Dr. Hastings, could you go over the pros and cons of working within government versus outside the government?
Well, mine, I stated earlier that when I was at the National Council of Radiation Protection and Measurements, and they had financial difficulties and laid off their entire scientific writing staff and decided to move to a contracting model. And that was uncomfortable. It was easier for me because I was part of a two-income household, but for some of my colleagues, it was devastating. And the government is much more secure. There's the myth of the government slacker, and I don't see that. We are all dedicated and committed, but there's a lot more job security in government than having to be dependent in a nonprofit on where the grants are coming from to pay the salaries.
I agree. I would say, there's definitely more stability in the government, but also a little bit more, regiment within the government where, you have to, work within the box to a certain extent, more than if you're in academia or in other things, you may have a little more creative license to go different directions. That's not always the case, but, that's what I've found more generally. But they're both good places to work if you can find good jobs. I found it's more about finding the position and the people who you're working with, enjoying them, than it is about where exactly you are.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so we're at the top of the hour. So I will use this time to thank our panelists for taking time out of their day to chat with us. This was awesome, and we really appreciate your expertise, the ability to kind of look back at where you were and kind of provide us with that advice, I think is fantastic. And I know we all cling to every word that, once graduate students now say. So thank you. And thank you to Alice and crew who have kind of helped me put this event together. And anyone in the audience, again, if you have any questions or want to reach out, contact information is in the chat, or feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about the specific event. And with that, I will say thank you, everyone. I hope you guys have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thanks. This is great. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, everybody, and best of luck to
Thank
you
you guys
all.
so much. Thanks for attending.
Thanks, guys.
Bye. Thanks.